The smell of rosemary and roasted garlic still lingered in the air when my wife told me to quit my job or find another family to belong to. It wasn't shouted. Emily didn't raise her voice. She said it the way she discussed grocery lists or weekend plans, calm, measured, already decided. Across the table, her mother sat wrapped in a pale blanket, watching me with that quiet, assessing look she'd perfected over the years, as if she were measuring not what I said, but what I was worth in that moment. "A real husband shows up," Emily added, folding her hands like she'd just explained something obvious. "He doesn't hide behind conference calls while his wife's mother needs him." I remember noticing small things instead of answering. The condensation on my wine glass, the faint hum of the dishwasher, the way the light reflected off the oak table I'd spent months designing and paying for. It struck me then that nothing in that room had happened by accident except, apparently, the part where I thought I had a say in my own life. Carol tilted her head slightly. "If work matters more than family," she said softly, "then perhaps you married into the wrong one." There it was. Not a request, not even a negotiation, a reassignment. Emily leaned forward just enough to make it final. "Quit your job and take care of my mother, Daniel. Or go find yourself another family." For a long moment, I said nothing. I looked at my wife, then at her mother, then at the house that existed, largely because I had built the life that paid for it, and then I nodded. "You're right," I said, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. "Family makes sacrifices." I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, and met her eyes. "I'll do it. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 41 years old, a senior corporate attorney at a firm that bills in hours most people don't see on a clock, and for the last 16 years I've built a career on being the person clients call when something is too large, too complex, or too expensive to get wrong. I don't say that to impress anyone. It's just the simplest way to explain how my life came to be structured: long days, late nights, and a level of consistency that most people mistake for control. Emily used to say I was the engine of our life. Not in private, she said it at dinners, at parties, to friends who asked how we managed the house, the trips, the quiet stability that seemed to hold everything together. She'd smile, touch my arm, and say, "Daniel keeps everything running." People would laugh, I would nod, and it always felt like recognition. Looking back, it was closer to categorization. We'd been married 14 years, no children, by choice at first and then by momentum. We built a routine that looked, from the outside, like partnership. We traveled when schedules aligned, hosted when it made sense, maintained a home that felt deliberate in every detail. It was the kind of life that suggests balance without ever actually requiring it. I handled what was difficult. Emily handled what was visible. Between the two of us, it appeared seamless. Financially, the math was never complicated. Emily had a solid career, stable, respectable, well compensated. But the house we lived in, the neighborhood it sat in, the renovations that turned it into something people commented on, all of that rested primarily on my income. The down payment had come mostly from my side. The mortgage, month after month, cleared from my account. The upgrades, the kitchen, the flooring, the lighting were decisions I funded and she curated. I never held that over her, not once. I didn't believe marriages worked that way. If anything, I thought removing that tension was part of my role. Stability isn't just about money, it's about making sure no one feels like they're keeping score. That was my mistake, because when something becomes invisible long enough, people stop recognizing it as effort. It becomes baseline, expected, and eventually, it becomes something they believe they're entitled to redirect. By the time Emily looked at me across that table and told me to give up my career, she wasn't asking me to change my life. She was asking me to confirm that it had never really been mine. Carol Whitmore had never raised her voice at me, never insulted me outright, never done anything you could point to in a single moment and call unacceptable. That was what made her effective. From the beginning, she operated in suggestions, in tones, in carefully placed observations that sounded harmless if you repeated them out loud and corrosive if you lived with them long enough. "Daniel works very hard," she would say at family dinners, her smile soft, almost admiring. "I just hope he remembers what he's working for." It sounded like praise. It wasn't. It was a reminder that whatever I built would always be measured against what she believed I owed. Emily always brushed it off. "Mom doesn't mean it like that," she'd tell me later, usually while we were cleaning up or getting ready for bed. "She's just old-fashioned." The implication was always the same. The problem wasn't what was said, it was how I was choosing to hear it. So, I adjusted. I showed up earlier, left work events sooner when I could, made an effort to be present in ways that couldn't be questioned. It didn't change anything. Carol didn't escalate, she refined. A comment about how a house feels different when someone is in it during the day. A remark about how money can't sit beside you when you're sick. Nothing direct. Nothing you could argue with without sounding defensive. And when things actually needed to be handled, real things, inconvenient things, my phone was the one that rang. Insurance disputes. Contract reviews. The time a contractor tried to overcharge her for repairs. The time her neighbor threatened legal action over a property line. I handled all of it, not because anyone asked me to explicitly, but because the expectations settled in so quietly, it never felt like a choice. I was the one who knew how to deal with problems, so I dealt with them. What I didn't realize then was that I had been assigned a role long before that dinner. Not son-in-law, not family. Something more specific. I was the person you brought in when something needed to be fixed, funded, or contained. And like anything that works well enough for long enough, no one questioned it. Least of all me. There were moments, small ones, where the pattern showed itself clearly. Holidays where my contributions were acknowledged in passing, while decisions happened around me. Conversations where my opinion was welcomed, until it complicated something, and then quietly set aside. It wasn't exclusion in any dramatic sense. It was subtler than that. I was included, functionally, not emotionally. Emily never saw it that way. Or maybe she chose not to. To her, I was dependable, reliable. The person things could rest on without shifting. And Carol saw exactly what I was, and exactly how far that usefulness could be extended. So, when Carol fell, and everything started moving, it didn't feel like a sudden shift. It felt like the natural conclusion of a role I'd been playing for years without ever naming it. Carol fell in late October, on a set of narrow stairs she had refused to replace for years because, as she once put it, they still work if you pay attention. The call came in the middle of a meeting I couldn't step out of without consequences, and I stepped out anyway. By the time I reached the hospital, Emily was already there, pacing, her voice tight and uneven, in a way I hadn't heard since the early years of our marriage. From that point forward, everything defaulted to me. I spoke with the attending physician, then the orthopedic specialist. I authorized the imaging, reviewed the treatment plan, signed the paperwork Emily couldn't focus on long enough to read. When insurance started pushing back on coverage tiers, I handled the calls. When the question of rehabilitation came up, I researched facilities, compared outcomes, arranged a shortlist. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was just what I did when something needed to be stabilized. Carol's injury wasn't catastrophic, but it was serious enough to require structured recovery. Limited mobility, supervised exercises, consistent monitoring. Nothing unusual for someone her age, and nothing that couldn't be managed with the right support in place. So, I proposed it, a high-quality rehabilitation center for the first phase, followed by a home health aide and a physical therapist rotating through the week. I mapped out schedules, coverage, contingency plans. I even suggested splitting time among family: Emily, her brother, her sister, so no single person absorbed the entire burden. Each option was dismissed, one at a time, with reasons that sounded reasonable in isolation. Carol didn't want strangers. The rehab facility felt impersonal. Her son's schedule was too unpredictable. Her daughter had children and couldn't commit. Every path narrowed until there was only one left. Not because it was the best solution, but because it was the only one no one had a reason to refuse out loud: me. Emily didn't say it immediately. She circled it first, talking about flexibility, about how my work could be adjusted, about how I had more control over my time than most people. Control. That was the word she chose, as if the years I'd spent building a career that demanded precision and endurance translated into an ability to simply step away from it without consequence. I listened. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because I was starting to understand the shape of the conversation. This wasn't a problem they were trying to solve with me. It was a decision they were guiding me toward. By the time we left the hospital that night, the plan hadn't been stated outright, but it was already in place. Carol would recover at home. She would need constant attention, and the person best positioned to provide it, the person most capable, most reliable, most flexible, would be me. The fall hadn't created a crisis. It had revealed a structure that had been there all along. It wasn't the hospital that decided anything. It was the dinner table a week later, when Carol had been discharged and the house had already begun to rearrange itself around her needs. That turned assumption into command. I had just finished outlining a revised care plan, scaled, realistic, still built around professional support, when Emily cut in before I could finish. "We've talked about this," she said, her tone steady. almost rehearsed. Mom isn't going to a facility, and she's not having strangers in the house all day. I looked at her. Then at Carol, who sat quietly, but not passively, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on me with that same evaluating calm. So, what are you proposing? I asked. Emily didn't hesitate this time. You step back from work, she said. For a while, long enough for her to recover properly. There was no softness around it, no maybe, no could we. Just a clean, deliberate redirection of my life, as if it were a schedule conflict that needed resolving. I let a few seconds pass, not to create tension, just to hear how it sounded, without interruption. And my cases? I asked. My clients. You'll manage, she replied. You always do, Carol's voice followed. Gentle and precise. Family comes first, Daniel. Work will still be there when this is over. People always think they're more irreplaceable than they are. That was the moment it clarified. This wasn't about helping. It wasn't even about Carol. It was about whether I would accept that everything I had built, every hour, every decision, every obligation could be set aside because they had decided it should be. Emily leaned forward slightly, closing the space between us with intent. I need to know you're the kind of husband who shows up, she said, not just financially. Actually shows up. There it was again, not a question. A definition I was expected to step into. I could have argued. I could have laid out consequences, timelines, realities they were choosing to ignore. But I was already past that point, because arguing would have meant I still believed this was a discussion we were having together. It wasn't. So instead, I nodded. All right, I said quietly. If that's what this family needs, I'll step back. Emily's shoulders dropped, tension releasing, in a way that told me she had been waiting for that exact sentence. Carol's expression softened into something that looked almost like approval. They thought the decision had just been made. What they didn't understand was that all I had done was agree to the premise, not the outcome. I didn't bring it up that night. Not while Emily was still settling Carol into the guest room. We had already begun to treat like a recovery space. Not while the house was quiet in that artificial way it becomes when everyone believes a difficult conversation has been resolved. I waited until the next evening, when everything felt normal again, dinner on the table. The routine reassembled, the assumption that we were all aligned. That was when I spoke. If I'm stepping away from work, I said, setting my fork down carefully, then we need to address the financial structure of the house. Emily frowned slightly. Not defensive yet, just confused by the direction. What do you mean? I mean this house, I said evenly, glancing around the room as if seeing it from the outside for the first time. The mortgage, the taxes, utilities, maintenance, it was designed around my income. If that income disappears, this house stops making sense. Carol shifted in her chair. A small movement, but enough to signal attention. We have savings, Emily said. We'll be fine for a while. For a while, I repeated. And then what? She hesitated. Not because she didn't understand the question, but because she hadn't followed the thought that far. She didn't need to. Up until now, I had always handled the parts that extended beyond for a while. So, what are you suggesting? She asked. I'm suggesting we act like we believe what we're saying, I replied. If family comes first, then everything else adjusts around that, including how we live. The room went quieter. The kind of silence that doesn't announce itself but settles into the spaces between words. We sell the house, I continued. We remove the largest expense we have. We simplify. And we move here, with your mother. It puts me exactly where I'm needed. Full time, no commute, no divided attention. Emily stared at me now. The confusion gone, replaced by something sharper. Sell the house, yes, that's extreme, Daniel. No, I said calmly. It's consistent. Carol's eyes moved between us. Calculating. She hadn't expected this. Neither had Emily. The version of sacrifice they had in mind didn't include altering their own comfort. There are other options, Emily said quickly. We don't have to go that far. You said this was about what's necessary, I replied. Not what's convenient. She opened her mouth, then stopped, because anything she said to push back would require her to contradict the very argument she had used to corner me. Carol spoke then, carefully. Living here would be crowded. It would. I agreed, but temporary discomfort for the sake of family seems like a reasonable trade. Another silence. Longer, this time. Emily looked at me as if trying to find the version of me she expected, the one who would offer a compromise, soften the edge, find a middle ground that protected everyone from the full weight of their own words. I didn't. So that's my condition, I said, my voice steady, leaving no space for misinterpretation. I step away from my career. We sell the house, and we reorganize our lives around what you've both said matters most. Neither of them spoke, because for the first time in this conversation, agreement had a cost they couldn't redirect. I met Olivia Grant at 9 the next morning, before the city had fully settled into its usual noise. Her office was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, no wasted movement, no decorative clutter pretending to be warmth, just clean lines, organized files, and a woman who didn't ask how I felt until she understood exactly what I needed. I didn't start with emotion. I started with facts. I laid out the structure of the house purchase, the down payment, the mortgage history, the renovations, the accounts the payments had come from. I showed her timelines, transfers, documentation I had kept out of habit, not foresight. Olivia didn't interrupt. She listened, asked for clarification where it mattered, and built a picture in silence that felt more precise than anything I could have explained. When I finished, she leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. "Do you believe this marriage is recoverable?" she asked. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a threshold. "No," I said. She nodded once. "Then, you need to stop behaving like it is." There was no judgment in it, just direction. We moved from there into structure. She explained how to separate what was legally mine from what could be contested, not through concealment, through clarity. Documentation, traceability, the difference between shared access and actual ownership. She told me what needed to be copied, what needed to be secured, and what needed to stop immediately. I opened a separate account that afternoon, not hidden, not illegal, just no longer passively shared. I rerouted future income streams that were solely mine. I created a clean line where before there had only been assumption. "This isn't about taking anything from her," Olivia said as we finalized the initial steps. "It's about making sure nothing that is yours continues to be treated as undefined." When I left her office, I didn't feel angry. I felt aligned. Later that day, I went to see Michael Reeves, the managing partner at the firm. I didn't dramatize the situation. I told him I needed to step back temporarily for a family medical issue, that I wasn't leaving permanently, and that I wanted a defined return point. He studied me for a moment, the way people do when they're deciding whether you're still reliable. "You coming back?" he asked. "Yes." "Then, your seat stays yours." That was all I needed. There was even an unspoken understanding that certain work could continue quietly, selectively. Not enough to draw attention, enough to keep the engine running. When I got home, Emily was in the kitchen, reorganizing cabinets to make space for her mother's medications. She looked up when I walked in. "Did you talk to your firm?" she asked. "I did. And I'm stepping away," I said. 2 weeks to transition everything." Relief crossed her face so quickly she didn't bother to hide it. "Good," she said, exhaling. That's the right call." Carol, from the other room, murmured something approving I didn't need to hear clearly. I set my keys down, watched them both for a moment, and said nothing else, because everything that mattered had already been put in place. They believed I had just given something up. What I had actually done was stop letting them decide where it went. The realtor walked through the house 2 days later, her voice bright, efficient, already speaking in terms of angles, light, and resale value. Emily followed her from room to room, arms folded tightly across her chest, nodding at the right moments, but never quite engaging. This was the first point where the decision stopped being theoretical for her. It wasn't about sacrifice anymore. It was about losing something she could touch. "We'll want to declutter this space," the realtor said, gesturing toward the living room. "Keep it neutral. Let buyers imagine themselves here." I stood near the doorway, listening, watching Emily glance at the walls we had chosen together, the furniture she had curated, the small details that had made the place feel like hers. None of that mattered to the market. And for the first time, I could see her realizing that none of it had been protected by anything except my continued ability to fund it. "Do we really need to move this quickly?" she asked, turning to me once the realtor stepped into the next room. "You said this was necessary," I replied evenly. "This is what necessary looks like." She didn't answer, not because she agreed, but because she didn't have a version of her argument that didn't collapse under its own weight. The listing went live within the week. Showings followed almost immediately. Strangers walked through our house, commenting on the layout, the finishes, the light. Emily stopped being present for them after the second day. She would leave before they arrived or stay upstairs, as if removing herself might slow the process down. It didn't. An offer came in faster than she expected, then another. The numbers were strong enough that delaying would have been irrational. I reviewed the contracts, adjusted where needed, and accepted one that closed cleanly, without complications. When I told her, she went very still. "So that's it?" she asked. "We're just Done here? Yes, I said, we are. The final week in the house felt like living in a place that had already decided to forget us. Rooms emptied. Walls lost their context. The things that had once signaled stability reduced to objects waiting to be moved. On the last night, we sat in the kitchen with takeout containers and no real furniture left around us. Emily kept trying to frame it as temporary, as something we would recover from once things went back to normal. I didn't correct her, because normal was exactly what I had just removed. The move to Carol's house happened in a single afternoon. What didn't fit was donated or stored. What did fit was compressed into spaces that had never been designed to hold 3 adult lives at once. Carol stood in the doorway as we brought things in, her expression shifting, almost imperceptibly from satisfaction to something closer to unease. The house felt smaller with us inside it. Heavier. Emily walked through the rooms as if trying to map a version of her life onto them and failing. I carried the last box into what would be my room, a narrow space with just enough room for a bed, a desk, and the sense that something fundamental had been reduced. Behind me, I could hear Carol calling Emily's name. Already needing something. Already assuming availability. I set the box down, closed the door halfway, and stood there for a moment in the quiet. This was the life they had insisted was right. Now we were all living inside it. The first morning started before sunrise. I woke to Carol calling my name from down the hall. Not loudly, but persistently. The way someone does when they expect to be answered eventually, no matter how long it takes. For a moment I lay still, orienting myself in a room that still felt temporary. Then I got up, already aware that there was no version of this day that belonged to me anymore. By the time Emily came downstairs, I had already organized Carol's medication, prepared a breakfast that matched the dietary guidelines the doctor had outlined, and set up the exercises she was supposed to complete before noon. It wasn't difficult, it was structured, predictable, the kind of system I knew how to build. What I hadn't accounted for was how quickly effort becomes invisible when it's expected. "That's too much salt," Carol said after the first bite, setting her fork down with quiet disapproval. "And the tea is too strong." I adjusted it without comment. Emily moved through the kitchen with her laptop open, scanning emails, pausing just long enough to ask, did she take her morning pills, without looking at me when I answered. By mid-morning, I had scheduled her follow-up appointment, coordinated with the physical therapist, and handled a billing issue her insurance had flagged. None of it was acknowledged, not because they were ungrateful in any overt way, but because gratitude implies surprise. And there was nothing surprising about me doing what I had always done, keeping things from falling apart. The pattern settled in quickly. Carol needed help moving. I was there. She needed something adjusted, something brought, something explained. I handled it. Every task had a logic to it, a sequence that made sense if you stepped back far enough. But there was no endpoint, no moment where the work was considered complete, only the expectation that it would continue. By the end of the first week, my days had compressed into a series of functions: manage, prepare, respond, repeat. Emily left for work in the morning and returned in the evening with the practiced exhaustion of someone who believed she had carried the heavier load. She would ask how things went, listen just long enough for an answer, then shift the conversation to her day, her deadlines, her frustrations. Carol's commentary sharpened in small, precise ways. "You fold towels differently," she observed one afternoon, watching me from the couch. "Emily learned the proper way years ago." I refolded them. "Men aren't as attentive to detail," she added. Not unkindly, just factually, as if stating something that didn't require debate. I didn't respond, because responding would have suggested this was a misunderstanding. It wasn't. At night, when the house finally quieted, I went to the small desk in my room, opened my laptop, and returned to the part of my life that hadn't been surrendered, at least not entirely. Files I had kept active, conversations I had left open, work that still required precision, still respected it. The contrast was sharp. In one room, I was reduced to function. In another, I was still recognized for capability. I moved between those two realities without comment, without announcement, letting them exist side by side, because the point wasn't to resist what they had asked me to become. The point was to fully inhabit it, long enough for everyone involved to understand exactly what it cost. Emily asked for the money 2 weeks in. It wasn't framed as a demand, not at first. We were in the kitchen, Carol resting in the next room, the late afternoon light flattening everything into something that almost looked calm. "My car's making a noise again," she said, scrolling through her phone. "I should probably get it checked before it gets worse." A pause. Then, more casually, "Can you transfer me a couple thousand from the house money, just to be safe?" House money. I looked at her for a moment, letting the phrase sit there between us. What house money? I asked. She frowned. Like I was being deliberately difficult. The money from the sale, Daniel. The money that came in last week. Oh, I said slowly. Something in my tone made her look up properly this time. That's not what you think it is, I continued. Her expression shifted confusion first, then irritation. What does that mean? We sold the house, that's our money. I shook my head once, not sharply, just enough to make the line clear. No, I said. It isn't. Silence dropped into the room. Heavier than anything we'd said so far. The down payment came from my side, I went on, my voice even, almost clinical. The mortgage, the renovations, the equity growth, it's all documented. I've already had it reviewed. Structurally. Legally. That money is tied to me. Emily stared at me as if I'd switched languages mid-sentence. But we're married, she said. That doesn't just disappear. It doesn't. I agreed. But it also doesn't automatically become something you can draw from without question. Her face hardened. So what? You're just keeping it while we're here. Doing this? We're here, I said. Because this is what you said was necessary, and we're living on your salary. Exactly the way you said we could. From the other room, Carol's voice cut in, sharp with something that wasn't quite anger yet. Daniel. That's not how family works. I didn't raise my voice. This is exactly how it works, I said, when everything else has been stripped away. Emily's hands tightened around her phone. You're being selfish. I met her eyes. No, I said quietly. I'm being precise. Neither of them spoke after that, because for the first time since this started, the assumption that I was an open resource, something to be accessed, redirected, spent had been removed. And without it, the version of this life they had insisted on was already beginning to fracture. By the end of the 6th week, Carol no longer needed help getting from the bed to the chair. By the 8th, she was moving through the house with a cane, slow but steady, her dependence shrinking day by day into something that could no longer justify what had been demanded of me. I had already confirmed it before anyone else said it out loud. Doctor's notes, follow-up assessments, a physical therapist's report that downgraded her from full-time care to periodic support. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet, clinical conclusion that the situation had changed. I arranged the rest myself. A certified home health aide, scheduled for check-ins, transportation for appointments, a system that required far less of anyone living in the house, and far more of the professionals who were trained for it. Everything documented, everything in place. Then I waited until a Sunday evening, when Emily and Carol were both in the same room. The television on but not really watched, the air carrying that low-level tension that had become normal. I have an update, I said. Emily looked up first. What about next steps? That got Carol's attention. She's no longer in a condition that requires full-time care, I continued. The doctor confirmed it. I've arranged ongoing support. Someone qualified will be here starting Monday. Emily sat up straighter. Wait, what do you mean, starting Monday? I mean, I'm going back to work. The words landed cleanly. No build-up. No apology. Emily blinked. Like she'd misheard me. You can't just decide that. I'm not deciding it now, I said. I decided it when this stopped being necessary. Carol's grip tightened on the arm of her chair. I still need help. You'll have it, I replied. Just not from me. Full time, Emily's voice sharpened. We agreed no, I cut in, not raising my voice, just removing the space she was trying to occupy. You told me what you expected. I met that expectation. For 6 months, I stepped away from my work, reorganized my life, and took responsibility for your mother's recovery. She's stable, she's mobile. The situation that justified that arrangement no longer exists. Silence stretched, thick and immediate. Emily stood. So, that's it, you just walk away now? I held her gaze. No, I said. Now we deal with what comes next. I reached for the folder I had placed on the table before sitting down and slid it across to her. She looked at it, then at me, then back at the page on top. The header was simple, clear. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Emily didn't touch it at first. You're serious, she said finally, her voice lower, thinner. Yes. You can't do this after everything, after what I just did. I finished for her. I did exactly what you asked. I gave up my position. I sold the house. I moved here. I took care of your mother. I reorganized my life around a decision you made for me. Carol tried to interject. Daniel? I didn't look at her. You didn't ask for help, I said, still focused on Emily. You issued a directive. You decided my career was optional, that my time was flexible, that my identity could be paused and reassigned because it was convenient for you. Emily shook her head, backing away slightly as if distance might change the meaning of what she was hearing. That's not what this was. It is exactly what it was, I said. You just didn't expect it to be temporary. The words settled, and this time neither of them interrupted. I watched you live inside the arrangement you insisted on, I continued. The financial pressure, the loss of space, the constant tension. You couldn't sustain it for weeks. You resented it almost immediately. But you expected me to accept it indefinitely. Emily's expression shifted anger. Confusion. Something closer to fear underneath it. That's not fair, she said. No. I agreed. It isn't. I pushed the folder a few inches closer to her. I'm not asking for anything from you, I said. No support. No division that isn't already documented. The house proceeds have been reviewed. The records are complete. If you challenge them, it will be expensive and it will not end the way you think it will. Carol was silent now. Completely. Emily finally reached for the papers. Her hands slower than before. Like they belonged to someone else. You're really doing this, she said. I already did, I replied. For a long moment, no one spoke. And for the first time since that dinner, there was no argument left to make, no version of family that could be used to redefine what had already happened. Emily signed. 11 days later. I didn't attend the meeting. Olivia did. That was part of the structure. Clean lines. No unnecessary friction. No space for the kind of emotional negotiation that turns decisions into delays. From what I was told, Emily's attorney reviewed everything twice before advising her to proceed. The documentation held. The financial separation was clear. There was no leverage to argue from without creating a situation that would cost more than it could recover. So she signed. After that, things moved quickly. Emily stayed in her mother's house. At least at first, it made practical sense. No immediate housing decision. No need to rebuild from zero overnight. But practicality has a way of exposing what comfort used to hide. Without me there, the small tensions that had once been absorbed without notice had nowhere to go. They didn't disappear. They redirected. Carol still needed help, just not enough to justify the kind of life they had tried to construct around her. The aid I had arranged continued to come. Structured and consistent, but the rest of it, the daily adjustments, the constant presence, became shared responsibility. Not theoretical anymore. Not assigned to someone else. From what I heard, it didn't go smoothly. That didn't surprise me. I returned to the firm on a Monday morning in early spring. No announcements. No ceremony. I walked through the same doors, took the same elevator, and stepped back into an office that had been held exactly where I left it. My name was still on the door. My work was still waiting. The difference was internal, not external. I wasn't returning to prove anything. I was returning because it was mine. The first few days were precise, focused, almost quiet. I picked up files, re-entered conversations, moved back into a rhythm that had never actually stopped. It had only been redirected. There was no sense of catching up, just continuation. The part of my life that had been set aside resumed without resistance, as if it had been waiting for me to remove everything that didn't belong. A month later, I signed the lease on a new place, not a house. I didn't need the scale or the statement, just a clean, controlled space with enough light and silence to think without interruption. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimal lines, nothing that required maintenance beyond what I chose to give it. Everything in it was intentional. Nothing in it depended on someone else misunderstanding its purpose. The first night there, I stood by the window and looked out over the city, the same skyline I had been part of for years. The same grid of decisions and structures and outcomes that had always made sense to me. For a long time, I had thought I was maintaining a life. What I had actually been maintaining was a system, one that worked as long as I didn't question where everything I gave was going, or why it was always expected to be available. Losing that system didn't feel like loss, it felt like removal. And for the first time in years, there was nothing in front of me that required negotiation, justification, or permission. Everything I built from that point on would belong exactly where it was placed. And to me, if this story made you think, tell me, would you stay? Or would you walk away like Daniel? This story was created by the Fish Tells Stories team for entertainment purposes only. Do not attempt to apply it in real life under any circumstances.